Dear community, welcome to another interview. Events are overturning. After Russia already announced a partial mobilization last week and the four regions in eastern Ukraine announced their affiliation with Russia by referendum, the two pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2, were blown up. Perpetrators so far unknown. This means a further escalation of the already extremely tense situation. Today, I'd like to discuss with my guest Germany's role in the conflict and how threatening the security situation in Europe is. Hi, Scott.
Hello. How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Thanks. Yeah, Scott, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time today to be doing this interview with me. Before we start, I'd like to introduce you. You are a former US Marine Corps intelligence officer. You served in the Soviet Union as an inspector implementing the INF Treaty, and you were for 7 years UN weapons inspector. And yeah, today I want to talk about the current political events. How do you see in general Germany's role in this conflict? The German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock had recently said that Germany stands on the side of the Ukraine, no matter what my own voters say about it. So how do you see Germany's role, Scott?
Well, when I say, how do I see Germany's role? I used to think that Germany was a democratic country. But when the foreign minister can stand up and say, I don't care about the German people, you're irrelevant to me. The will of the German people means nothing to me. I only care about Ukraine. What does that tell you? Is Germany a democracy? Or is the German government working for somebody other than the German people? What is Germany's role here? This is where I have to get harsh. When I grew up in Germany, I was there in the 1970s. There were many 50-year-old men who had fought in the Second World War. The people that I interacted with were alive during the Second World War, during the time of Adolf Hitler, and they understood Germany's past. They understood the crimes that Germany committed, and they understood the absolute necessity that Germany could never again position itself to be involved in similar crimes, especially crimes that are linked to the ideology of National Socialism, Nazi ideology. And yet today, Germany is embracing a Nazi regime in Ukraine, a regime that is bought into the ideology of Stepan Bandera, a man who fought alongside the SS, the man whose troops participated in the slaughter of Jews, the man who slaughtered Poles, slaughtered Russians. And Germany is calling him their ally? Come on now. What is Germany's role here? To facilitate the rebirth of Nazi ideology in Europe? Get real. It's disgusting. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. German people need to wake up and reread history and understand what happened the last time Germany embraced this odious ideology. You're heading down the wrong path, Germany. You're heading down the wrong path. You're empowering Nazis because you have bought into an American narrative that has painted Russia as the bad guy. Russia didn't attack the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. America did. So who's the bad guy here? Germany's on the wrong side of history. The wrong side of history. And is it the German people? Well, we don't know because the German government doesn't care about the German people. My understanding is the German government may very well put troops in the streets in October to suppress German citizens who are upset about the policies of the government, who are concerned about their future. Is this the action of a democracy, to put troops in the street to suppress the free will of their own citizens? Well, we know the German government doesn't care about their citizens. Maybe it's time the German citizens take matter in their own hands. I don't know. I'm not a German. It's up to the Germans. But I will tell you this, study history. When Tsarist Russia put Tsarist troops in the streets to suppress the will of the Russian people, the Tsarist government ceased to exist. Maybe it's time the government for Chancellor Scholz ceases to exist. I prefer to see it be done by democratic means. But if the Germans want to be a democratic nation where the will of the people counts first and foremost, then you have to remove those in office who don't care about you, such as the government of Scholz, his foreign minister, his defense minister, everybody else who is selling Germany's future for Stepan Bandera embracing Ukrainian neo-Nazis.
But so far, if I'm reading the media, they are telling me that it's Russian propaganda that Ukraine is a country controlled by Nazis, and they also claim that Russia is not interested at all in a diplomatic solution, and that Putin is not a guy, not a politician that you can negotiate with. Is Russia interested in a peaceful outcome to the war?
Well, remember, Russia didn't start this war. Everybody's going to say, oh, wait a minute, it was Russian tanks that went across the border. Again, Germany, you were part of the Normandy format. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Germany, together with France, said, we will work with Ukraine to come up with a mechanism that will bring an end to the civil conflict that had erupted in Donbass in 2014. So in 2015, Germany said, we'll be part of the Minsk II agreement. We will make sure that the Ukrainian government enacts legislation that protects the rights of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in the Donbass in exchange for the Donbass remaining part of Ukrainian territorial integrity under Ukrainian sovereignty. Russia was all for this. Russia wanted this. That's diplomacy in action. So anybody who says that Russia wasn't interested or isn't interested in diplomacy literally is ignorant of history. You know who wasn't interested in diplomacy? The Ukrainians. You know who wasn't interested in diplomacy? The Germans. The Germans. The Germans sat there knowing full well that the Minsk II Accord was nothing more than a sham to buy time for NATO to arm Ukrainian forces so they could forcefully conquer the Donbass in total disregard of Minsk II. Germany is a member of NATO. So while Germany is pretending to negotiate Minsk II, it's involved in a process of training Ukrainian troops to fight ethnic Russians in the Donbass. Who wasn't interested in diplomacy? Russia? No. Germany wasn't interested. Germany's never been interested in diplomacy. And then what Germany did is buy into the notion of expanding NATO to incorporate Ukraine, even though everybody knew that this was a Russian red line. Russia had no choice but to carry out the actions it did to defend the interests of the Russian people in Donbass. Now, even afterwards, we know that the Russians were meeting in Istanbul in April with the Ukrainian authorities. And at that time, the Russians were saying, we are willing to have a peaceful resolution to this so long as Ukraine recognizes the independence of Donbass. We will get out of everywhere else. That's diplomacy. Who rejected it? Great Britain. Who went along with the rejection? Germany. Germany has no interest in a peaceful resolution, but maybe they do today. Why? Because Russia's winning. Russia just took over four formerly Ukrainian oblasts. They're now part of Mother Russia. Germany's in a panic right now because the Ukrainian army is defeated. Russia's ready to escalate. Russia's ready to drive to the Polish border. Is Russia looking for a diplomatic solution? Why would they? Was America looking for a diplomatic solution with Japan after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, after the Japanese betrayed international peace and security? No. The negotiation took place on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945, unconditional surrender. And after listening to President Putin speak today, I think Ukraine's future is clear. Unconditional surrender. I'm sorry, Germany. That's what happens when nations call you friend. You're the friend of Ukraine. All Germany's done is guarantee that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have died. That millions of Ukrainians have lost their homes forever. That's what Germany did. That's what diplomacy did. Russia's going to solve this problem by making sure that Germany never again interferes in the sovereign affairs of Ukraine. Again, I'm just speaking bluntly here. This is Germany's fault. Germany's not an innocent player here.
Let's also talk about the sanctions policy against Russia, because we can see that, first of all, we, the people, are suffering from this. We can see it in our wallets. And at the same time, the European Union is now in the process of imposing an eighth package of sanctions against Russia. So, Scott, what is the purpose? What purpose do the sanctions serve? Or what's the goal behind it?
Well, the goal of the sanctions, they're American-driven sanctions that were designed to ostensibly punish Russia, to inflict so much harm on Russia that Russia would be unable to continue its military operation, that the economy of Russia would collapse, and that the citizens of Russia would rise up in the streets and remove Vladimir Putin from power. That was the goal. The secondary goal was to divorce Europe from Russian energy. This is a long-term objective of the United States. And but the United States promised Europe that there was a plan B, that don't worry, if you no longer have access to Russian gas, we have a plan B that will mitigate the harm that's brought about. A couple things. One, Russia knows energy apparently better than the United States does, and apparently better than Europe does. They understand global energy markets, and they understand how Russia interfaces with those markets. They also understand the vulnerabilities of Europe to, energy supply. And the United States set Europe up for failure. I mean, yes, at the end of the day, the German people have to blame their government for buying into these policies when every energy security expert in the world knew exactly what was going to happen. This wasn't a secret. Everybody knew it was going to happen. And yet the German government went along with it. But they also have to blame the United States for creating this false promise that sanctions would hurt Russia more than they would hurt Europe. Russia's not hurting. Russia's doing quite well. The ruble's very strong. Their economy is healthy. Their people aren't rationing gas. They're not shutting out the lights. They're not creating warm rooms. They're just living life a way that the Germans won't be living life this winter. So clearly the sanctions didn't work. And, one of the questions the Germans have to ask is, why are they allowing the European Union to continue to basically commit suicide? The European Union, the Eurozone can only exist because of Germany, can only exist because of the economic strength of Germany. Understand this, after this winter, Germany will no longer be a major economic power. Your economy is shutting down in front of you. Industries are shutting down, and they won't come back. They won't come back. So Germany has condemned itself to going from the most powerful economy in Europe to a mid-level economy, or even worse. Why? Why are the Germans going along with this? Why are the Germans committing suicide? What benefit is there in it for you? Have the Germans truly become a nation of sheep? Because that's what you sound like. You sound like nothing more than a bunch of compliant lambs being led to the slaughter, baying as you head into the booth where your throats are going to be slit, and you're apparently very happy about this. This is ridiculous. It's embarrassing. I'm ashamed for you.
Mm-hmm. Let's also talk about the Ukrainian military. You said in an interview that the Ukrainian military has been transformed into a NATO military, and almost all of the fighters in Ukraine are foreign soldiers. Can you elaborate on that?
The vast majority of the soldiers fighting in Ukraine are Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah.
Let's start off about the Ukrainian military. On February 24th of this year, the Ukrainian military was the second largest military in Europe in NATO, or in Europe. Its military was well organized, well equipped, well trained. Let me be blunt here. If the Ukrainian army had fought the German army in a head-up combat in February, they would have destroyed the German army in less than a month. If they had fought the French army, it would have been a similar outcome. The Ukrainian army was very, very good, very large, very combat ready. And the Russians have destroyed that army, destroyed it straight up. 260,000 active duty forces when the war started. Over 60,000 have been killed. That number is probably closer to 80,000 right now. And the number of wounded, we don't know. The Russians say over 40,000. I would guess that number is closer to 120,000. But that army has ceased to exist. What's replaced it is an army where you have Ukrainian troops, but these troops are trained on NATO soil. They're trained in Germany, Grafenwöhr. They're trained in England, Sandhurst and other places. They're trained in France. They're trained in Poland. They're equipped by NATO. All the former Soviet Union equipment is gone, destroyed, eliminated by the Russians. And they're now totally equipped by the West. They're supported with Western intelligence, Western communications, Western logistics, Western command and control, and a significant number of Western mercenaries. This is not a Ukrainian army. This is a NATO army, plain and simple. It may have Ukrainian generals who sign the orders, but the orders are dictated to them by a planning staff in Ramstein, Germany, that sits down and figures out what's going to happen. A planning staff in Poland that does the same thing, transmits instructions to their Ukrainian puppets, who then carry this out in a manner that befits NATO, not Ukraine. Take a look at what's happening right there. Ukrainians just spent the summer building up tens of thousands of strategic reserves, these NATO-trained, NATO-equipped forces. Where are they now? Dead or dying. They've been squandered, sent in a useless offensive into Kherson, which captured a bunch of empty land, and they're continuing to pound their head against the Russian wall in Lyman and other areas. To what end? To what end? To whose benefit? All that's happening is Ukrainian soldiers are dying by the tens of thousands. The Russians are dying by the thousands. And what about NATO? Germany doesn't care about Ukraine. France doesn't care about Ukraine. Nobody cares about Ukraine. All they care about is that the Ukrainian soldiers kill Russians. That's it. And Russia's fed up with it. That's why Putin gave his speech today. I think we're going to see a fundamental transformation in the nature of this conflict in Ukraine, where Russia is going to bring to bear the totality of its conventional military resources, not nuclear. All this absurdity about how Russia's going to drop a nuclear bomb on Ukraine is just that, absurdity. It's not Russian doctrine to do so. There's no reason for Russia to do so. Russia's winning this war. They're going to win this war, and they're defeating a NATO military in Ukraine as we speak. This should be a lesson to NATO. First of all, hey, Germany, how much equipment you got left? Not much, huh? Because you gave it all to the Ukrainians. You want to give the rest of it away? You want to give away your Leopard tanks, your Marder infantry fighting vehicles? To what? They'll be destroyed in Ukraine. Maybe it's better to let Russia destroy them in Ukraine with Ukrainian troops in it than Germany thinking they can stand up to Russia with German troops in this equipment. Germany's army is a pathetic joke. I don't mean that to be too harsh, but ask yourself, that reinforced battalion that you sent to Lithuania? Lithuania, why are German troops in Lithuania? But again, a student of history asked that question. Maybe people don't study history today. But there's German troops in Lithuania today, a reinforced battalion battle group. Germany had to cannibalize its armored forces to create this. Now NATO wants Germany to turn that into a brigade. Where's Germany going to get enough functioning equipment to make a brigade? And once you put it all into Lithuania again, why are Germans in Lithuania? But it doesn't matter. Nobody asked that historical question. Now what happens when Germany wants to pivot, east into Poland? Again, are we really talking about German troops going into Poland? Again, students of history should understand that these words should never leave anybody's lips. And yet, your wonderful chancellor is talking about spending $100 billion. Where is he going to get that money, by the way? Your economy is tanking. Where are you going to get the money to buy a military? Where are you going to produce the steel necessary to produce the tanks? Your steel industry shutting down because they can't afford the gas necessary to operate the furnaces. Germany's living in a fantasy world where they think they're something that they're not. Their military is a joke. Their economy is collapsing. And the German people have been transformed into compliant sheep. But now we come back to the Ukrainian military. Because I'll tell you what, those boys are fighting and dying. And Germany disgraces the sacrifice of every Ukrainian who dies on the battlefield because you've given them false hope. You've pretended to be their friend, but you're not their friend. You're nothing more than the compliant tool of the United States, who has never cared about Ukraine and only cares about using Europe to further its own national security interests, which in this case was to isolate Russia and to undermine Russia. It's failed. Russia's more united. Russia's stronger than ever. But what's left? A destroyed Ukraine and an embarrassed Germany.
Mm. You just said that the war will end with Ukraine's total surrender. Do you really think that the West will allow that to happen?
What can the West do? Allow it to happen. That implies that the West is in charge of something, that the West controls anything. Germany, you're falling apart. Literally, you're falling apart. And you think that you can suddenly dictate what's going to happen in Ukraine? You think anybody listens to you? What can you bring to the table? Nothing. Your pathetic economy, your compliant sheep-like population, your military that can't even get out of the barracks. No, NATO has sold its soul to the devil. The devil is the United States. And the United States is left with no option but to watch Russia destroy Ukraine. And that's about to happen. I haven't listened to every word that Vladimir Putin said, but my understanding is he's put the Ukrainians on notice that they should be returned to the negotiating table. But if they don't, I think you're going to see, there's a famous movie, a Russell Crowe movie, Gladiator, and there's a scene early on where he unleash hell. I think you're going to have the Russian version of Russell Crowe saying unleash hell, and hell's going to be unleashed on Ukraine, and there's nothing NATO can do to stop it. Because any NATO troops that cross into Ukraine no longer have Article 5 protection. Article 5 is self-defense if Russia attacks you. But if you decide to move into Ukraine, all you're doing is guaranteeing that the Russians will slaughter you. Has Germany called up its conscripts? Has France? Has anybody? Is NATO doing anything? Stoltenberg said he wants 300,000 troops. First of all, when he said that, every military person in Europe went, what? How come he didn't ask us first? Where are we going to get the money for this? Where are we going to get the troops for this? Where are we going to get the equipment for this? Europe's not mobilizing. Europe's sitting on its thumbs. I mean, that's just the reality. What is Germany? What is Europe going to do to stop Russia? They can't do anything. What, impose more sanctions? The more sanctions you impose, the weaker you get. Maybe it's time for Germans to start listening to the words of Angela Merkel. She may not be your chancellor anymore, but she's speaking wisdom that maybe only comes after you leave office. But she's speaking of the absolute necessity for a European-centric, European security framework that recognizes the legitimate national security interests of Russia. Wow. That's sort of what Russia was offering Europe in December of last year, and Europe ignored it. The United States ignored it. No one's ignoring Russia right now.
Let's also talk about like a potential of or the danger of a nuclear escalation, because Putin has announced that he will use nuclear weapons in a worst case scenario last week, as he announced as well the partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. So how do you see it? How big is the danger of a nuclear escalation of the situation, Scott?
Russia has a nuclear doctrine, published in 2020. There's only two circumstances under which Russia will use nuclear weapons. The first one is if Russia is attacked by nuclear weapons, then Russia will retaliate with everything it has. The second one is if the national survival of Russia is at stake, then Russia will use nuclear weapons to defend itself. And what Putin has been saying is that when Russia incorporates Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk into Russia, it becomes Mother Russia, and Russia has a constitutional responsibility to safeguard that. And if NATO and Ukraine seek to attack Mother Russia with the goal of stripping away Russian territory from Russia, this is an existential threat to Russia, and Russia will use whatever means necessary to defend itself. So basically, Putin is putting NATO on notice not to get involved in this fight, stay out of this fight, because this is about Russian national security. This is about Russia's national survival. That's what he said. The danger here is that the United States and NATO don't seem to understand what Putin has said, or have deliberately chosen to misrepresent it for propaganda purposes. There's a lot of people right now talking about Russia using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Under no circumstances will Russia ever use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Under no circumstance. Why? Because if NATO decides to intervene in a way that threatens the national security of Russia, the nuclear weapons won't be dropped on Ukraine. They'll be dropped on Berlin. They'll be dropped on London. They'll be dropped on Paris. on Brussels, Europe will cease to exist. Why would Russia drop a nuclear weapon on Ukraine when the perpetrators of the crime against Russia reside elsewhere in Europe? So no, there won't be a Russian nuclear weapon dropped on Ukraine. Russia doesn't need nuclear weapons to defeat Ukraine. Here's the danger. Because Europe has created this scenario that Russia is going to use nuclear weapons, now everybody's struggling to come up with a way to deter Russia. So the United States and NATO are coming up with non-nuclear responses, so that if Russia nukes Ukraine, then the United States and NATO are talking about a non-nuclear response that will hurt Russia severely, up to and including perhaps decapitation strikes on Moscow. But from the Russian perspective, what are they hearing when they hear this? They hear that if we use a nuclear weapon, the United States and NATO are afraid to respond with nuclear weapons. So now we have a situation, and what is the United States and NATO hearing? That if Russia doesn't use nuclear weapons on Ukraine, which they're not going to, that means Russia is weak and Russia is scared and that Putin's bluffing. So now we have a situation where both sides are misunderstanding one another, and NATO may think that it can respond into Ukraine because Russia's bluffing and won't use nuclear weapons. And if NATO responds to Ukraine, Russia believes it can launch nuclear weapons against NATO, and the United States won't respond with its strategic forces because the United States is afraid to use nuclear weapons against Russia. This is a recipe for disaster. This is perhaps the most dangerous situation that's existed in Europe since the 1980s, since Able Archer 83, the infamous NATO command post exercise that almost brought about a nuclear war, since the Russian officer refused to put nuclear forces on alert when there was a false reading. I lived in Europe in the 1970s and 80s. I know what the INF movement was. I remember the demonstrations on the street. I remember Europe mobilized against nuclear weapons. And I was a part of the inspectors that went into the Soviet Union to get rid of those weapons, to eliminate that threat. I spent a lot of time and effort making sure that Europeans could go to bed at night and never have to worry about nuclear weapons being fired on their cities. From 1988 until 2018, for literally 30 years, people like me kept Europe safe because of the work we did. And there were Russians that did the same thing. And yet, because Europe has gone along with America, supporting the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, supporting the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, supporting the withdrawal from Open Skies, every European today needs to go to sleep tonight wondering if they'll wake up in the morning. That's how dangerous it is right now. Maybe it's time the Germans and the Europeans get back into the streets and demand that their governments insist on returning to the period of the 1980s where disarmament was the most important thing. Getting rid of nuclear weapons was the most important thing, instead of continuing to support Stepan Bandera worshiping people. And you say it's propaganda. I actually think there was a German newspaper that interviewed a Ukrainian ambassador in Germany, and the guy sat there and talked about visiting the grave of his hero. So it ain't propaganda. The only propaganda is the garbage that Germans are swallowing from the United States.
Talking about propaganda, there's one important person we missed, we didn't talk about so far. It's Joe Biden. I remember as he was in Poland, he called Vladimir Putin a butcher. And what do you think? Would it be better for us, for the security in Europe, if Donald Trump would still be president of the United States in that situation we are in?
No. Look, I think it's time that Europe understand that the problem isn't Joe Biden. The problem isn't Donald Trump. The problem is the United States. It doesn't matter which political party our leaders come from. The United States is poison to Europe. The United States doesn't support Europe. Europe only exists to further American goals, whether they be a Democratic president or a Republican president. It's just a statement of fact. So, rather than waiting for the next knight in shining armor to arise, does Europe really think that Barack Obama was their friend? Do friends listen in on the conversations of their friends? Ask Angela Merkel how she feels about that. Barack Obama disrespected every European out there. He was a nice face, a nice smile, spoke nice words, but behind the scenes, he was just like every other American president, using Europe for the benefit of the United States. So the best thing to do is to stop waiting for a good American president to arrive who will solve all your problems and start solving the problems yourself. The first problem you have to solve is divorcing yourself from your absolute dependence upon the United States.
Okay, Scott, I would say these are good words to finish the interview. Thank you so much for your time and all the best wishes to the US.
Well, thank you, and good luck to you too.
Thank you. And thank you as well, dear community. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you soon. Bye.